The storm came like grief, sudden, violent, and with no regard for the careful walls Isabel Duarte had built around her life. At 2:17 a.m., lightning split the Nevada sky above Pine Ridge, illuminating the skeletal remains of the Clearwater Bridge in stark, accusatory detail. The same bridge where her husband Marcus had died 18 months ago. The same bridge she could see from every window of the small house she'd chosen specifically for its proximity to her torment. Rain hammered against the glass with increasing fury, each droplet a percussion note in nature's violent symphony. The bone-dry desert transformed before her eyes into a treacherous maze of flash floods and rushing water. Arroyos that had been dusty scars just hours ago, now flowing with the muddy lifeblood of the storm. Isabel sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee that had grown bitter hours ago, watching nature reclaim the landscape with the same merciless efficiency that had claimed her marriage, her plans, her faith in solid ground. She'd chosen this exile for a reason. Some wounds needed to be tended in private, away from well-meaning friends who insisted it was time to move forward, as if grief operated on some predetermined timeline. The house was small but solid, built in the 1960s by a mining engineer who understood the desert's moods. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled perpetually of sage and dust, and windows that framed the broken bridge like a monument to loss. But tonight, the storm seemed determined to move forward for her, whether she was ready or not. Thunder rolled across the desert like distant artillery, shaking the windows in their frames and sending vibrations through the floorboards. Beneath her bare feet, Isabel found herself thinking, not for the first time, that she should probably subscribe to a weather service. The thought made her smile grimly, an expression that had become her default over the past year and a half. As if advance warning would have prepared her for any of the storms that had reshaped her life. As if knowing Marcus would die that day would have somehow made the loss more bearable. She remembered their last morning together with painful clarity. Marcus had made pancakes, burning them slightly the way he always did because he insisted on multitasking, reading engineering reports while cooking, sketching structural details on napkins between flips. "You know," she'd said, stealing a piece of bacon from his plate, "for someone who builds bridges, you sure can't manage breakfast without setting off the smoke alarm." He'd laughed, that deep rumble she'd fallen in love with 12 years earlier, and kissed her forehead. "Bridges are predictable, mi amor. Pancakes are chaos theory in action." Those had been among his last words to her. Chaos theory in action. If only he'd known how prophetic they were. The pounding on her door came between thunderclaps, desperate and urgent against the howling wind. Isabel froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. In 18 months of self-imposed isolation, she'd had exactly 3 visitors. The mailman, who left packages on the porch and hurried away, a persistent insurance adjuster who'd finally given up trying to discuss additional coverage for flood damage, and her sister Eleanor, who'd driven up from Sacramento 6 times before accepting that Isabel wasn't ready for rescue. Another round of pounding, more frantic now. Through the rain-streaked window, she could make out 2 figures huddled on her porch, one tall, one small. The smaller figure was a child, and something about the desperate way they clung to the adult's hand sent a jolt of recognition through Isabel's chest. She'd been that child once, terrified and trusting adults to keep her safe in a world that suddenly made no sense. Isabel's bare feet hit the cold hardwood as she moved toward the door, her engineer's mind automatically cataloguing risks even as her heart lurched at the sight of a kid out in this weather. The power had cut out 20 minutes ago, and her emergency radio crackled with flash flood warnings every few minutes. Anyone caught on the county roads tonight was in serious trouble. The desert didn't forgive poor timing or bad decisions. She, opened the door to chaos incarnate. A man in his 30s, soaked through and breathing hard, clutched the hand of a girl who couldn't be older than 8. Both were shivering violently, their clothes plastered to their bodies by the relentless rain. Water streamed from their hair, their faces pooling on her wooden porch in widening puddles. The man's jeans were torn at the knee, revealing a scrape that was still bleeding, and his jacket bore the telltale tears of someone who'd been running through brush. "Please," the man gasped, water streaming from his dark hair and into his eyes. "My truck's stuck on the old county road about 2 miles back. There are men. They're following us. This is the only house for miles." His accent carried traces of East Coast urban life, Boston maybe, or Philadelphia, definitely not local. The girl looked up at Isabel with enormous dark eyes that seemed far too old for her face, and something in that gaze, trust mixed with terror and a heartbreaking attempt at bravery, made the decision for her. "Get inside, both of you," she said, stepping back to give them room. They stumbled over the threshold, bringing with them the smell of rain and fear and something else. Desperation, maybe, or the particular scent of people who'd been running for their lives. The man carried a battered canvas pack that he clutched like a lifeline, and Isabel noticed how his eyes swept her living room, cataloguing exits and sightlines with the careful attention of someone accustomed to trouble. Military training, maybe, or law enforcement, or just someone who'd learned the hard way that safety was always temporary. "I'm David," he said, still catching his breath and dripping steadily onto her hardwood floor. "This is my daughter, Maya. I know how this looks, strangers in the night asking for help, but I swear to you, we're not dangerous. We're just, you're bleeding," Isabel interrupted, pointing to the cut above his left temple. In the lamplight, she could see scrapes on his hands and a tear in his jacket that suggested a hasty exit from somewhere uncomfortable. "And you're both hypothermic. Everything else can wait." Maya pressed closer to her father, and Isabel felt an unexpected pang of recognition. She remembered being 8 years old herself, remembered how the adult world could suddenly turn frightening and incomprehensible, how safety could evaporate in an instant. Her own childhood had been stable, loving, nothing like whatever was happening here. But fear was universal. Terror didn't care about circumstances. "Let me get you some towels," she said, moving toward the linen closet. "And something warm to drink. Hot chocolate for Maya, coffee for you." As she pulled dry towels from the shelf, David spoke quietly behind her, his voice careful and measured. "Are you Isabel Duarte?" The towels slipped from her hands, landing in a soft pile on the floor. She turned slowly, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm settling in her chest, like ice water. "How do you know my name?" David's grip tightened on his pack, knuckles white with tension. "Your husband was Marcus Duarte. He worked for Henderson. Construction!" The world tilted sideways. Marcus had been dead for 18 months, killed when a support beam gave way during what should have been a routine final inspection of the Clearwater Bridge. A tragic accident, according to the official report filed by Henderson Construction and rubber-stamped by county officials. A preventable tragedy, according to Isabel's own engineering analysis of the debris, analysis that no one had wanted to hear, that had been dismissed as the desperate theories of a grieving widow who couldn't accept the randomness of loss. But she'd been right. Deep in her bones, in her engineer's understanding of structural failure and material stress, she'd known something was wrong with the official story. The beam that failed had been rated for 3 times the load it was carrying. The bolts that gave way were supposed to be grade 8 steel, not the cheap substitutes that had actually been used. She'd tried to tell investigators, tried to push for a more thorough examination, but grief had made her seem unstable, unreliable. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I worked with Marcus, not for Henderson, for the county. I was one of the inspectors on the bridge project." David's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the pack. "He gave me this the day before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should bring it to you." With trembling hands, Isabel accepted the pack. It was heavier than she'd expected, the canvas worn soft with age and use. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth, was a rusted metal lockbox she recognized immediately. Marcus had kept it in his home office. Always locked, always private. She'd respected his need for work boundaries, trusted him to handle the technical details while she focused on her own projects with the State Transportation Department. Now she wondered what secrets she'd been. Too trusting or too naive to question. The lockbox was secured with a combination lock that looked like it had been salvaged from an old school locker. The metal was pitted with rust, but still solid, still protecting whatever Marcus had deemed important enough to hide. "What's in it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Part of her had known for 18 months. "Evidence," David said. "Simply photos, documents, cost overruns, material substitutions. Henderson Construction cut every corner they could find on that bridge project. Corners that killed your husband and could have killed hundreds more if that bridge had opened to public traffic." The lockbox felt like it weighed 100 pounds. In her hands, Marcus discovered this. During the final inspections, yes. He started noticing discrepancies, bolts that didn't match the specifications, concrete that looked wrong, welds that were sloppy. He began documenting everything, taking photos, collecting samples. He was going to report Henderson to the State Attorney General. Isabel's legs felt suddenly weak. She sank into her kitchen chair, still holding the lockbox. They killed him? Not directly. But they knew the beam was compromised. They knew it would fail under inspection load, and they sent him up there anyway, hoping he wouldn't notice the problems before it was too late to stop the project. David's voice was grim. It was murder by criminal negligence. Maya tugged on. Her father's jacket, her small voice cutting through the weight of revelation. "Daddy, are the bad men still coming?" As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across the living room windows, bright beams cutting through the rain like searchlights. David tensed immediately, pulling Maya behind him as he moved to peer through the curtains. His body language shifted into something predatory and alert, a wolf protecting his cub. "3 vehicles," he said. "They found us." Isabel's mind raced through possibilities, her engineer's training taking over even in crisis. The house was isolated but not defensible. Too many windows, too many approaches, no secure room. The desert offered no cover for miles in any direction, and with the storm raging, the county road would be impassable for most vehicles within the hour, which meant their pursuers were either very determined or very well equipped. "Who are they?" she asked, moving to another window to get a better view. "Henderson's people, maybe, or police he's bought. I honestly don't know how deep this goes." David's voice carried the weight of 3 days' worth of fear and exhaustion. "I've been running since Tuesday. Maya doesn't understand why we can't go home." The 8-year-old looked up at Isabel with that same trusting gaze, and something fierce and protective stirred in her chest. She thought of Marcus, of the careful way he'd analyzed structural problems, of his fundamental belief that every building should be a sanctuary, every bridge a safe passage. She thought of all the people who would cross the bridges, Henderson. Construction built in the future, trusting their lives to structures compromised by greed. "How many are there?" she asked, moving to the window herself. "I count 4, maybe 5. David's hands were steady. Despite the circumstances, his breathing controlled. Military training, definitely. They're not local law enforcement. Local. Cops would have called for backup, announced themselves. These guys are operating off the books. Outside, the men were organizing themselves with military precision. Isabel watched them through the rain. noting the expensive equipment, the coordinated movement patterns, the way they positioned themselves to control all approaches to the house. These weren't opportunistic thugs or corrupt small-town police. They were professionals, which made them infinitely more dangerous, but it also made them predictable. Professionals followed protocols, made calculated decisions based on risk assessment, and Isabel had spent her career calculating risk, analyzing failure points, finding the weakest links in complex systems. "The bridge," she said suddenly. David looked at her with confusion. "What?" "The Clearwater Bridge, the one where Marcus died." Isabel was already moving toward her closet, pulling out the emergency gear she'd stored there out of habit rather than hope. Rope, flares, first aid supplies, emergency food. There's a maintenance catwalk underneath the main structure that's still intact. It crosses the river about half a mile from here. In this storm, with Maya, Isabel knelt in front of the little girl, meeting her eyes directly. "Maya, have you ever been on a really tall playground? Like one of those big jungle gyms with the rope bridges?" Maya nodded solemnly. "I like the scary ones, the ones that bounce." "Good, because we're going to go on the biggest, scariest playground in the whole world. But it's going to be dark and wet and very windy. Do you think you're brave enough?" For that, the child considered this with the serious concentration only 8-year-olds could muster. "Will you be there too?" "I'll be right there with you. I promise." Maya straightened her shoulders. "Okay, I can be brave." Isabel felt her heart break a little at the child's courage. "Children are actually better at this kind of thing than adults," she told David. "Better center of gravity, less body weight to manage. And right now, it's our only option." The sound of car doors slamming cut through the rain. Isabel counted. 4 distinct impacts. David had been right about the numbers. They were outnumbered and definitely outgunned, but they had advantages too. Local knowledge, better understanding of the terrain and the storm itself, which would make pursuit difficult. "There's a back door through the kitchen," she said, shouldering her emergency pack. "The trail to the bridge starts about 50 yards behind the house, near that big boulder. In this storm, they won't be able to track us until morning, and by then we'll be long gone." David hefted Maya onto his back, securing the lockbox inside his jacket where it would stay dry. "You don't have to do this. This isn't your fight." But it was, Isabel realized. It had been her fight from the moment Marcus died, from the moment she'd chosen isolation over investigation, grief over truth. She'd spent 18 months hiding from the questions that kept her awake at night, afraid to dig too deep into the circumstances of his death because she wasn't sure she could handle the answers. Now the answers had literally arrived at her door, demanding action. They slipped out through the kitchen as voices became audible at the front door. Men calling, out trying to sound official. Isabel led them through the driving rain, her feet finding the familiar trail by instinct and memory. She'd walked this path hundreds of times over the past 18 months, always stopping at the bridge approach, never crossing. Tonight felt different. Tonight crossing meant more than just getting to the other side. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark black and white snapshots. Twisted juniper trees, bent almost horizontal by the wind. Arroyos that had been dry creek beds now running with fast-moving water. And ahead of them, the broken spine of the Clearwater Bridge, jutting into the stormy sky like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. "There!" David shouted over the wind, pointing back toward the house. Flashlight beams were visible through the rain, moving with purpose and coordination. Isabel picked up the pace, her engineer's mind automatically calculating distances and angles. The maintenance catwalk was solid. She'd inspected it herself. After the bridge collapse, one of the few elements of the structure that had been built to proper specifications. But in these conditions, with a child, the crossing would be treacherous at best. They reached the bridge approach as the first serious flash flood surge hit the river below. Water that had been ankle-deep an hour ago was now a torrential, debris-filled torrent that would sweep away anything or anyone that fell into it. Uprooted trees tumbled past like matchsticks, and the sound of rushing water nearly drowned out the thunder. "Jesus Christ," David breathed, looking at the churning chaos below. Maya pressed her face against her father's neck. "I'm scared, Daddy." "I know, sweetheart, but Isabel's going to help us get across. She's an engineer. She builds bridges." The girl lifted her head, looking at Isabel with new interest. "You really build bridges?" "I design them," Isabel said, clipping her safety harness to the catwalk's anchor point. "I make sure they're strong enough to hold people when they need to cross from one place to another. Like the crossing she'd needed to make for 18 months, from grief to whatever came next. From the person she'd been before Marcus died to whoever she was supposed to become after. The maintenance catwalk was a narrow metal walkway that ran beneath the main bridge deck, originally designed to allow inspection and maintenance of the structure's underside. When the bridge had collapsed, taking Marcus with it, this lower level had survived, creating an inadvertent crossing point that local maintenance crews still used when the river was low. But tonight, the river was anything but low. It raged beneath them like a living thing, brown water mixed with debris and foam, carrying away everything the storm had collected in its passage across the desert. Isabel clipped her safety line to the guide cable and started across, testing each step carefully. The metal grating was slick with rain, and the wind tried to push her sideways into the void with each gust. The catwalk swayed under her weight, an alarming reminder that it had never been designed for this kind of stress. She forced herself to focus on the engineering, on the calculations that would keep her alive. The structure could handle the load. She checked the specifications herself. The wind was the wild card, the unpredictable force that could turn a manageable risk into a fatal mistake. Halfway across, she heard the sounds of pursuit getting closer. Voices shouting over the storm, flashlights sweeping the trail they'd just left, but the rain was working in their favor, washing away footprints and making tracking nearly impossible. "Come on," she called back to David and Maya, her voice nearly lost in the wind. David started across with Maya, clinging to his back like a monkey, moving carefully but steadily. The catwalk groaned and swayed under their combined weight, and Isabel held her breath as each gust of wind threatened to unbalance them. Maya had her arms wrapped around her father's neck, her face buried against his shoulder, trusting him completely to keep her safe. They were 20 feet from the far side when the flashlight beams found them. "There! On the bridge!" The first shot rang out over the storm, the bullet ricocheting off the metal handrail in a shower of sparks that was visible even through the rain. Maya screamed, and David instinctively dropped lower, shielding her with his body while still trying to maintain his balance on the narrow walkway. "Move!" Isabel shouted, reaching for them as another shot whistled past, close enough that she felt the air displacement. David half ran, half crawled the remaining distance, adrenaline overriding caution. Isabel grabbed Maya first, pulling the child to safety, then hauled David onto solid ground as more bullets sparked off the catwalk behind them. The three of them tumbled into a pile on the far side of the bridge, breathing hard and shaking with adrenaline. "They can't follow us across," Isabel gasped, looking back at the swaying catwalk. "Not in this storm, not with that much weight and no safety equipment." David was checking Maya for injuries, his hands shaking with more than just cold. "You okay, baby? You hurt anywhere?" "I'm okay, Daddy. That was really scary, but I was brave, right?" "You were the bravest," he assured her, kissing the top of her head. Isabel looked back across the bridge, where their pursuers had stopped at the edge of the catwalk. Even professionals had limits, and crossing that narrow span in these conditions, with no safety equipment, was functionally suicidal. She could see them conferring, probably calling for backup, or trying to find another way across the river. "They'll wait for morning," David said, following her gaze. Try to find another crossing point, maybe bring more equipment. By morning, we'll be long gone. Isabel shouldered her pack, water streaming from her jacket. There's a ranger station about 2 miles up the canyon. They'll have radio contact with the outside world, and Deputy Rodriguez is usually on night duty. She's good people. She'll listen to what we have to say. They started hiking up the muddy trail that wound along the canyon wall, Maya riding piggyback. On her father again, despite his exhaustion. The storm showed no signs of lessening, and Isabel found herself thinking about the biblical symbolism of water. Cleansing, renewal, destruction, rebirth. She'd been drowning in grief for 18 months, letting it wash over her in waves. Tonight felt like the beginning of something else, like breaking the surface and taking her first real breath. The trail was treacherous in the rain, muddy and slippery with loose stones that could turn an ankle or send someone tumbling down the canyon wall. But Isabel knew every twist and turn. She'd hiked this route dozens of times over the past year, usually alone, usually carrying more emotional weight than physical gear. Having companions changed the experience entirely. An hour into their hike, as they rounded a bend near Widow's Rock, a formation Isabel had always found personally offensive, they encountered other refugees from the storm. Maria Santos, a local rancher Isabel knew by sight from trips to town, was trying to help her pregnant daughter reach higher ground. But Elena Santos was clearly in active labor, the baby coming whether the weather cooperated or not. Please, Maria begged when she saw Isabel's flashlight cutting through the rain. Elena's having contractions every few minutes. The baby's coming tonight, storm or no storm. Isabel's first instinct was to keep moving. They had their own crisis to manage, their own lives to protect, their own race against time to win. But looking at Elena, 19 years old, frightened, soaked to the skin, and facing the prospect of giving birth in a desert storm, she saw herself at 8 years old again, trusting adults to make the right choices when the world stopped making sense. We helped them, she said to David, not really asking for his opinion. He nodded without hesitation, already lowering Maya to the ground. Maya, you're going to help me set up a shelter, okay? We're going to be doctors tonight. Really? Maya's eyes lit up despite the circumstances. Really? Isabel's going to help the baby be born, and you and I are going to make sure everyone stays warm and dry. They found a shallow cave in the canyon wall, just large enough to provide some protection. From the worst of the rain, Isabel used emergency blankets and rope to create a windbreak, while David and Maya gathered what dry wood they could find in the surrounding brush. Within 20 minutes, they had a small fire going, more for morale than warmth, and Elena was lying on Isabel's sleeping bag, gripping her mother's hand as another contraction peaked. I've never delivered a baby, Isabel admitted to Maria as she knelt beside Eleanor. Neither have I, the older woman replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. But women have been doing this for thousands of years without hospitals or doctors. The baby knows what to do, Elena cried out as another contraction hit, her face contorted with pain and effort. She was just a kid herself, Isabel realized. Probably not much older than Isabel had been when she'd met Marcus. Too young to be doing this alone in a cave during a storm that seemed determined to wash the world clean. You're doing great, Isabel heard herself saying, falling into a coaching role she'd never expected to play. Just breathe through it. Let your body do the work. It knows what it's doing. Maya sat nearby, wide-eyed but fascinated rather than frightened. Is the baby coming now? Soon, Isabel said, checking Elena's progress and trying to remember everything she'd ever read about childbirth. The reality was messier, more primal, more miraculous than any textbook could convey. The hours passed in a blur of coaching Elena through contractions, monitoring her breathing and trying to project calm confidence despite having no medical training whatsoever. David kept the fire going and maintained watch for any signs of their pursuers. Maya fell asleep curled up in David's jacket, exhausted by the night's adventures, but somehow still managing to look peaceful. Outside, the storm raged on with biblical fury, as if the desert were being baptized in preparation for something new. Isabel found herself thinking about cycles, destruction and renewal, death and birth, the way life insisted on continuing even in the darkest moments. Maybe especially in the darkest moments. At 4:47 a.m., as the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, Elena gave a final, tremendous push, and her daughter slipped into the world, slick and squalling and absolutely perfect. Isabel found herself crying as she helped clean the baby, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of new life emerging from chaos. "She's beautiful," Isabel whispered, placing the tiny girl on Elena's chest. The baby's first breaths were loud and strong, a declaration of existence that seemed to fill the cave with hope. Her cries were the most wonderful sound Isabel had heard in 18 months, pure, uncomplicated, full of life and possibility. Isabel looked around at their small group, a fugitive father and his impossibly brave daughter, a grandmother who'd walked miles through a storm to help her child, a teenage mother who'd just brought new life into an uncertain world. This was humanity at its best, she realized. This was what Marcus had believed in when he'd insisted that every structure should be built to last, should protect the people who trusted it. "What will you name her?" Maya asked, suddenly awake and fascinated by the tiny newcomer. Elena smiled through her exhaustion, her face radiant despite everything they'd been through. "Esperanza. Hope." Isabel felt something crack open inside her chest. A wall that had been holding back 18 months of frozen grief suddenly giving way. She'd spent so long focused on death, Marcus's death, the death of their plans, the death of her faith in the future, that she'd forgotten life's stubborn insistence on continuing, on finding a way forward even through the darkest storms. The baby, Esperanza, wrapped her tiny fingers around Isabel's thumb with surprising strength, and Isabel understood with sudden crystalline clarity what Marcus would have wanted her to do. Not hide from the truth of his death, but use it to protect others. Not retreat from the world in grief, but engage with it more fully in his honor. "We need to get moving soon," David said gently as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "They'll start looking for us again as soon as it's light enough to track." Isabel nodded, but she was already thinking beyond their immediate escape. The lockbox contained evidence of corruption that had killed her husband and potentially endangered countless others. The authorities needed to see it, but more importantly, the public needed to know. Henderson Construction had other projects, other bridges, other opportunities to cut corners and risk lives for profit. They helped Elena and her new daughter into a makeshift stretcher David created from branches and emergency blankets. The new mother was weak but stable, and little Esperanza seemed determined to make her presence known to the world. The hike to the ranger station took another 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and check on Elena and the baby. But with each step, Isabel felt lighter, more purposeful. The storm had washed away more than dust and debris. It had cleared away the fog of grief that had surrounded her for so long, leaving her vision sharp and her purpose clear. The ranger station was a welcome sight when it finally came into view. Solid stone walls, solar panels on the roof, and most importantly, lights in the windows that meant someone was on duty. Isabel could see the radio antenna against the clearing sky, and felt hope rise in her chest like a sunrise. Deputy Sheriff Angela Rodriguez met them at the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she took in their bedraggled group. "Isabel, what in the world are you doing out here, and who is that a baby?" Isabel looked at David, who nodded and carefully removed the lockbox from his jacket. The metal was still dry, still protecting the secrets that had cost Marcus his life. "Delivering evidence of murder," Isabel said clearly, "and bringing new life into the world." The next few hours passed in a controlled whirlwind of activity. Angela contacted the state police, the FBI, and the county prosecutor's office. David's story was verified through multiple databases. He'd been exactly who he claimed to be, a county inspector who discovered Henderson's corner cutting too late to save Marcus, but not too late to prevent future tragedies. The lockbox contained a treasure trove of evidence, photographs of substandard materials being installed, documents showing systematic cost overruns and budget manipulations, recorded conversations between Henderson executives discussing bribes and cover-ups. There were safety reports that had been falsified, inspection records that had been altered, and a paper trail of corruption that stretched back several years and involved dozens of public works projects across 3 counties. "This is going to bring down the entire operation," Angela said, reviewing the meticulously organized documents Marcus had compiled. "Henderson, his foreman, probably half a dozen county officials, maybe more." Isabel felt a grim satisfaction, but also something deeper, a sense of completion, of justice finally being served. Marcus's death hadn't been meaningless if it ultimately prevented other deaths. The bridge he'd died inspecting would be rebuilt properly with full oversight and genuine safety standards. Future bridges would be stronger because of his sacrifice. "What happens to Maya and me now?" David asked, watching his daughter sleep peacefully on a cot in the station's break room. "Witness protection, probably," Angela replied. "At least until the trials are over. Henderson's people aren't going to give up easily, and you're the key witness in what's going to be the biggest corruption case this state has seen in decades." Isabel looked at Maya, who had drawn a picture of the baby being born in the cave, and left it on the desk for everyone to see. The little girl had been through more in one night than most adults experienced in a lifetime, but she seemed remarkably resilient, adaptable in the way children could be when they trusted the adults around them to keep them safe. "I want to testify," Isabel said suddenly, the words coming out with more force than she'd intended. "At the trials, I want to explain exactly how the bridge failed, what corners were cut, what it cost. I want them to understand that this wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the social contract we have with the people who build the things we depend on." Angela nodded approvingly. "We'll need your expertise. You're probably the only person qualified to translate all this technical evidence into terms a jury can understand." As the immediate crisis wound down and the various law enforcement agencies took over the investigation, Isabel found herself sitting on the ranger station's small porch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape washed clean and somehow renewed. Everything looked sharper, more vivid, as if she were seeing the world in high definition for the first time in 18 months. David sat down beside her, Maya now awake and playing quietly with a set of toy cars Angela had found in the station's lost and found box. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for believing us, for helping us cross that bridge, for delivering that baby, for—" He gestured helplessly at the magnitude of what had transpired in a single night. "Thank you," Isabel replied, meaning it completely. "For bringing me the truth, for giving me a reason to leave that house, to engage with the world again. I've been hiding for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be useful. What will you do now?" Isabel considered the question, surprised by how many possibilities suddenly seemed to stretch ahead of her. Yesterday, her future had been a blank wall, an endless repetition of days spent avoiding the world and nursing old wounds. Now it felt like an unbuilt bridge, full of potential and purpose. "I think I'll go back to work," she said slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Real work, bridge inspection, safety consulting, maybe teaching at the university. There are too many structures out there that need someone who actually cares about whether they'll hold. Maya looked up from her cars, fixing Isabel with that direct gaze that seemed far too wise for an 8-year-old. Are we safe now? We're safe, Isabel confirmed, and realized she was talking to herself as much as to the child. They were safe, and more than that, they were moving forward. All of them. The little girl brightened. Can we go see the baby again? Esperanza? Isabel laughed, the sound feeling strange and wonderful after so many months of silence. I'm sure we can arrange that. I think your dad and I are going to be spending quite a bit of time with lawyers and investigators over the next few months. Looking out at the desert morning, she thought about bridges, not just the concrete and steel structures she'd spent her career designing, but the connections between people, the trust that allowed strangers to help each other across dangerous crossings, the faith required to take the next step into an uncertain future. Marcus was gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. But his death had meaning now, purpose that extended beyond their personal tragedy. The bridge that had collapsed and claimed his life would ultimately save many others. Sometimes the most important crossings weren't over rivers or canyons, but over the spaces between who you were and who you could become. The storm had passed, the baby had been born healthy and strong, and the truth was finally coming to light. Isabel Duarte was ready to build bridges again, in every sense that mattered. As she sat on that porch watching the sun rise over a world washed clean by rain, she made a mental note to call her sister Elena when they got back to civilization. It was time to stop hiding from the people who cared about her. Time to let them know she was ready to rejoin the world. Time to step out of exile and back into the messy, beautiful, dangerous work of living. After all, bridges weren't built to stand empty. They were meant to be crossed, to carry people safely from one side of their lives to the other. And Isabel finally felt ready to walk across her own bridge into whatever came next, knowing she wouldn't have to make the journey alone. The investigation that followed would expose one of the largest construction fraud schemes in Nevada's history. Henderson Construction's systematic corner-cutting had compromised not just the Clearwater Bridge, but dozens of other projects across the state. Roads that should have lasted decades were already showing signs of premature failure. Water treatment. Plants built with substandard concrete were developing dangerous cracks. School buildings constructed with inferior steel were deemed unsafe and had to be evacuated. But Marcus's meticulous documentation made the case airtight. Every falsified report, every substituted material, every bribe paid to look the other way, it was all there, organized with the same careful attention to detail he'd brought to every project he'd ever worked on. Isabel testified as the prosecution's lead technical expert, translating engineering specifications into human terms, helping juries understand how a few pennies saved on each bolt could add up to catastrophic failure. The trials took 2 years. Henderson himself was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His company was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims' families and fund the rebuilding of compromised structures. 6 county officials were convicted of accepting bribes. The state overhauled its inspection and oversight procedures, implementing Marcus's suggested safety protocols as the new standard. David and Maya entered witness protection for 18 months. But they emerged safely when the last appeals were exhausted. Maya had grown 3 inches and developed a passionate interest in engineering, specifically bridge design. She'd started building elaborate structures out of whatever material she could find, testing their load-bearing capacity with increasing sophistication. She's got a natural understanding of structural principles, Isabel told David during one of their regular visits. Have you thought about engineering camps for next summer? Maya, now 10 and startlingly articulate, looked up from the model suspension bridge she was constructing from pasta and string. "I want to build bridges that don't fall down," she said matter-of-factly, "like the one we crossed in the storm." Isabel felt her heart squeeze with pride and something deeper, a sense of legacy continuing, of Marcus's passion for safe, sound construction living on in unexpected ways. She'd been working as a consultant for the past year, traveling the country to inspect bridges and buildings, teaching safety seminars, writing articles for engineering journals about the hidden costs of corruption in construction. The work was demanding but satisfying in ways her old job had never been. Every structure she cleared for public use, every safety violation she caught and corrected, felt like a small victory for Marcus's memory. She'd also started teaching part-time at the University of Nevada, introducing young engineers to the ethical dimensions of their profession. "Your husband would be proud," David said, watching Maya explain the physics of tension and compression to Isabel with the earnest intensity only children could muster. "I think he'd be proud of all of us," Isabel replied. "We kept going. We didn't let his death be meaningless." Elena Santos had named her daughter well. Little Esperanza, now a sturdy 2-year-old with her grandmother's fierce determination and her mother's gentle heart, had become something of a local legend. The baby born in a cave during the storm that changed everything. Maria often brought her to visit Isabel, and the toddler had developed a fascination with Isabel's engineering models and blueprints. "Bridge," Esperanza would announce, pointing at Isabel's latest project drawings. "Big bridge. That's right, Mija," Isabel would say, lifting the little girl so she could see the plans better. "A big, strong bridge that will keep people safe." The new Clearwater Bridge was scheduled to open in 6 months, built to Isabel's specifications with materials that exceeded every safety standard by significant margins. The design incorporated Marcus's suggested improvements and several innovations Isabel had developed during her consulting work. It would be one of the strongest, safest bridges in the state, a fitting memorial to the man who died trying to prevent exactly the kind of disaster it was designed to withstand. On quiet evenings, Isabel would drive out to the construction site and watch the work progress. The bridge was beautiful in its functionality, every beam and bolt precisely engineered for maximum strength and longevity. But more than that, it represented something larger, proof that truth could emerge from tragedy, that love could be transformed into protection for others. She'd started dating again tentatively, a fellow engineer named Robert who shared her passion for structural integrity and her belief that buildings should be sanctuaries. It was early still, fragile as new concrete, but it felt right in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Marcus would have liked him, she thought. Marcus would have wanted her to be happy. The little house in Pine Ridge sat empty now, listed for sale but still unsold. Isabel had moved back to Sacramento, closer to her sister and her work, but she kept the desert house as a reminder of where she'd learned to live again. Sometimes she would drive out there just to sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint. The sky in impossible colors. The Clearwater Bridge site was visible from that porch, though the old ruins had been cleared away to make room for the new construction. Soon there would be a strong, safe crossing where tragedy had once struck. People would drive across it without thinking about the man who died to make it possible, and that was as it should be. The best memorials were the ones that protected people without requiring their conscious gratitude. Isabel had learned to carry Marcus's memory differently now, not as a weight that held her back, but as a foundation that supported whatever she chose to build next. Love didn't end with death. It transformed, becoming the strength that allowed the living to continue living, to keep building bridges between what was and what could be. The desert taught patience, persistence, and the value of deep roots. It taught that survival often looked like destruction from the outside, that sometimes you had to let old growth die back completely before new life could emerge. Isabel had spent 18 months in the desert, letting grief strip away everything she thought she knew about herself. What remained was stronger, more resilient, better able to weather whatever storms lay ahead. She thought often about that. Night, the storm, the desperate flight across a broken bridge, the miracle of Esperanza's birth in a cave while the world washed clean around them. It felt like something from a fable, too symbolic to be real, but her hands still bore the faint scars from gripping that metal catwalk, and Maya still sent her drawings of the baby being born in the storm. Sometimes, the most important journeys weren't from one place to another, but from one version of yourself to another. Isabel Duarte had crossed that bridge in the storm as a woman drowning in grief, and emerged on the other side as someone ready to build again, to love again, to trust that the future could hold joy as well as loss. The storm had passed, but its gifts remained. Clarity, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that even in the darkest night people could find ways to carry each other across dangerous places toward safety, toward hope, toward whatever waited on the other side of fear. In the end, that's what bridges were really for, not just spanning physical distances, but carrying the human heart across the spaces that seemed impossible to cross alone. Isabel had learned to build those bridges too, one careful connection at a time, trusting in the strength of properly placed love and the enduring power of hope to hold against whatever storms might come.